Nayara Energy's Vadinar oil refinery in Gujarat, India, has been hit by sanctions as the European Union unveiled its new punitive measures targeting the Russian energy sector. The EU sanctions include a lower oil price cap from $60 to $48 a barrel, the designation of the biggest Rosneft refinery in India, which is a Vadinar oil refinery, and the measures aimed at 105 shadow fleet ships. The EU's July 2025 sanctions on Nayara Energy's Vadinar refinery in Gujarat signals a decisive escalation in West's economic war on Russia. The basis of the sanction, as per them, is Rosneft's 49.13% ownership of Nayara Energy, which effectively gives Russian state significant influence in India's private refining sector itself. The EU claims that the third country refiners with Russian stakes help launder Russian crude into global markets, and this violates the spirit of sanctions and the oil price cap regime. This strategy is part of a broader escalation in the US-EU deep state plan to isolate Russia economically, hitting not just the Russian assets, but also its strategic partnerships in other countries. The European Union's increasing use of sanctions as a geopolitical lever, exemplified by its restrictions on India's Vadinar refinery due to Rosneft's stake, is a very significant step. It is the perpetuation of the neo-colonial mindset, assuming that the Western preferences can override sovereignty of nations in the global south and other parts of the world. From where we see targeting Russia's global energy interests, Europe is really embarking on a suicidal strategic trajectory. It is underestimating Russia's civilizational resilience and military strength, and it's overplaying its own leverage. This path may ultimately corner Russia into triggering a nuclear escalation, with Europe itself as being the primary battleground. Welcome to the Drishtikon show, where we go beyond the noise, pierce of the propaganda, and expose the phenomena and actions that others are too afraid to touch or approach. This is not just about politics, you see, it's about rediscovering the truth. So today we want to evaluate not just the latest EU sanctions against Russia, but also on the Indian refinery, the method behind the madness that Europe is following, and where the world is really headed because of the societal choices that the European leaders are making as a whole. We need to evaluate all of that. For that, let's unpack this whole European and American fetish with the sanctions. Fundamentally speaking, sanctions are an evolution of the colonial economic control. It is repackaged as morality. Well, we'll decide who you can trade with. We will dictate the terms of your alliances. We will enforce compliance through economic strangulation. This is very reminiscent of the East India Company model, where trade control was a precursor to the territorial and sovereign subjugation. The modern terminology for this is rule-based international order, which is really an architecture designed and enforced by the West for its own dominance. Sanctioning India's Vadinar refinery because of Russian stakeholding is not just an attack on Russia's economic interests, which it is, but it is also a direct affront to Indian sovereignty and strategic autonomy. Western policy operates on a fatally flawed assumption that they can sanction Russia hard enough and Putin will fall and Russia can be restructured to the Western advantage. Well, for one, Russia is not Iraq or Libya, and Russia is a civilization forged through Napoleonic invasions, the defeat of the Nazi Germany at a cost of 27 million Russian lives. Everybody remembers the Battle of Stalingrad, the collapse of the USSR, and the subsequent resurgence of Russia. Sanctions cannot break a nuclear-armed empire state that has endured great existential threats, which have been greater than the economic warfare that is going on currently. Europe is progressively trying to block the Russian energy supplies, sanctioning the third country processors of the Russian crude, and trying to expand the banking restrictions on the Russian affiliates. Yet, with each measure, Russia's strategic options shrink, but its retaliation increases. And history suggests that great powers facing existential threats do not collapse quietly. They lash out. Moreover, as the controversial economic forecaster Martin Armstrong has warned, Europe's path to war is not accidental, but engineered chaos. The crumbling economic model of Europe, exacerbated by the negative interest rates, and unmanageable debt has left its political elite with only one escape route, which is war. Armstrong says that without war, Europeans may soon start storming their own parliaments with pitchforks. Quite honestly, Europe's actions and gambles look suicidal. So EU countries are dependent on the Russian oil and gas, right? The alternatives are Norwegian and American oil, which is very expensive, or from Middle East, which is going through its own turmoil. So why would EU, which is so dependent on the Russian oil, be so existentially aggressive against Russia? And remember, Russia is no Iraq. It has enough and more nukes and weapon systems to attack and destroy Europe if Russia's existence is on the line. See, in Iraq, there was a confusion whether Saddam had the WMDs or not. In Russia, you have no such confusion at all. They have the WMDs and they are more than you and better than yours and more powerful than yours. And you are not sure whether Saddam would attack you or not. But Putin has laid out it very clearly that if Russia's existence is on the line, Russia will attack. From that perspective, EU's rhetoric and actions are as close to a suicidal strategy as one can find geopolitically. So what kind of calculations drives this madness that Europe is following? So let us try and understand a bit of it. Europe is essentially under the American strategic occupation through NATO. That's what it is. Post World War II, Europe's security policy has been tightly coupled with US interests. Germany, France, UK, each one of them has US military bases, nuclear umbrellas, and deep intelligence dependencies through Five Eyes. Any dissent, such as the one that France had in the past for autonomy, has been systematically crushed. You remember the CIA's destabilization of the French leadership in the 1960s? In other words, Europe is not entirely sovereign in strategic decision-making. The US wants to break Russia to prevent a Eurasian integration of Germany, Russia, China through energy and trade routes. We all know what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. It wants to maintain a US dollar hegemony by controlling the resource trade. For Europe to resist, it would have to decouple itself from the US security architecture, but no leader within Europe has the courage, except sometimes Macron starts whimpering. Germany's industrial machine was powered by the cheap Russian energy. Now with the Russian gas gone, the energy costs have skyrocketed. German industries are moving to US and Asia. Yet Germany keeps following the suicidal path because the German political elite, specifically the Greens and the Social Democrats, have ideologically painted Russia as the ultimate threat, amplified by the media and the US pressure. They also foolishly bet that Ukraine plus US LNG plus renewables could really compensate for Russian supplies. Well, it hasn't worked until now. And then there is Britain, which is the ultimate spoiler. The UK, post-Brexit, sees itself as a spoiler of any EU-Russia rapprochement, acting as a permanent Atlantic bridge to the US. The British intelligence, the policy circles push Europe into confrontation with Russia, ensuring Europe remains dependent on the US and UK remains relevant geopolitically thereafter. The Western strategists, particularly the EU and the US, have deluded themselves that thinking that Putin is actually fragile internally. They believe sanctions, military aid to Ukraine, and internal dissent will eventually topple Putin. They compare it to the 1980s Soviet Union, ignoring that Russia today is more economically resilient, militarily potent, and globally more supported than in the late Cold War. This is the same delusion that drove the Iraq War. Saddam will fall easily. And now they are saying Putin will fall if squeezed hard enough. Well, like we said, Russia is not Iraq. It's a nuclear superpower with unmatched hypersonic capabilities. So what are we missing here? What we are really missing here, and especially in EU and the US establishments or the think tanks, is that Russia is not a status quo power, especially when it is existentially threatened. And Russian doctrine includes a first strike nuclear use if their state is threatened. And the deeper the encirclement, the higher the probability that Russia will preemptively strike European targets before being weakened further. And yet, The Europeans keep dismissing this with, well, they are bluffing, they won't risk their own destruction. This is hubris. Given how Russia's national establishment mind works, it may be prepared for mutual destruction if the alternative is subjugation. And really speaking, apart from US and France, which other country in Europe really has the wherewithal and the weapon systems to really take on Russia without the US help? There is another factor that no one talks about, and we at Drishtikon have been discussing in our newsletters since July 22. It's the Arctic, stupid. The heart of this confrontation is not Ukraine or economic sanctions, but control over the Arctic, the new frontier of the global power. As analyzed in most of our Drishtikon assessments of the Arctic Circle, the Arctic holds immense reserves of hydrocarbons, minerals, and rare earths. New shipping routes due to ice melt could actually slash the global transit times. The Northern Sea Route, the NSR, offers a shorter alternative to the traditional routes like Suez Canal, and it reduces travel distances by up to 40% between Asia and Europe. And you know what? Russia controls 53% of the Arctic coastline, and it has created so many military zones, their bases, and it has fortified the entire area. Ukraine war was never about Ukraine, you see. That proposition never made any sense. Think about it. Why would the entire European continent put its existence on the line for a country like Ukraine, which offers Europeans nothing of value? With the future of trade and minerals dominance in play, it is as clear as daylight that the American and the European interest in Ukraine war was always about the Arctic Circle and dominance there. If one looks at the stakes and positions and the stances, then Arctic's crucial importance becomes very, very clear. If the West fails to control or contain Russia, it loses the Arctic to the Russian-Chinese bloc, and with it, the chance to control the energy and the trade routes of the future. The Arctic is a chessboard for the next global hegemony. That is why this is a fight to the finish for the Western powers. And all this is creating a parallel fallout. This entire war between, or this entire conflict between the EU and the Russia, especially with US backing the EU. The entire non-Western bloc, led by BRICS, is creating a parallel financial system. The BRICS nations are building alternative frameworks to challenge the Western financial hegemony. This includes the creation of a BRICS reserve currency, backed by the basket of member currencies and commodities like gold. The BRICS-based system is under development to facilitate cross-border digital payments, bypassing the US-dominated SWIFT system. Moreover, the bilateral trade agreements between Russia, China, and India are increasingly settled in local currencies, reducing dollar dependency. The parallel banking institutions like the New Development Bank within BRICS provide alternative funding outside of IMF and the World Bank constraints, empowering the global South nations to operate free from Western financial coercion. And India is pushing the rupee-ruble trade, defying the Western diktats. All this contributes to a scenario where de-dollarization starts accelerating. The European energy costs are surging, which is forcing the European industries to actually flee to Asia. And all this brings social unrest within Europe itself. Europe is behaving as though the military power does not escalate uncontrollably. It does not understand the escalation ladder itself with Russia. Nuclear threats are empty bluffs, they think. This hubris ignores Russia's clear doctrine. Nuclear use is acceptable if Russia's existence is threatened. And EU is gambling on the guidance from US deep state and their backing, the German economic myopia and lack of leadership, the British spoiler tactics, green energy ideological fantasies. This is a path of civilizational suicide for Europe, really. And for India, what are the alternatives and options that India has? Well, there is a new alignment underway these days, the Russia-India-China axis. This axis, the RIC axis, is a geopolitical realignment that directly counters the West's aggressive containment policies, particularly the Europe's suicidal march towards confrontation with Russia. As EU deepens its sanctions, cuts energy ties, and parrots NATO's war rhetoric, it is accelerating its own economic and strategic decline. In contrast, India, Russia, and China are re-establishing a pragmatic, multipolar framework that is centered on Eurasian cooperation, energy security, and regional stability. For Russia, the RIC format offers a diplomatic counterweight and a pathway to pivot eastwards amidst the Western isolation. China sees this as an opportunity to hedge its US decoupling risks, while India asserts strategic autonomy, resisting the Western pressure to join the anti-Russian coalitions. Together, the trio can bypass the Western financial choke points through alternative trade and payment systems, including local currency settlements. The RIC alignment should be seen together with BRICS. The emergence of BRICS Plus, specifically, combined with the deepening of a RIC axis, signals a fundamental shift in the global power, which is going away from the Atlantic order, dominated by US and Europe, and going towards a multipolar Eurasian-centered system. The eagerness of over 40 countries, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Argentina, Egypt, and others, to join BRICS reflects a global revolt against the Western hegemony. It's financial, military, and ideological. The BRICS plus RIC nations encompass 50% of world's population. They have vast national resources, including energy reserves, with Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. They have critical minerals, South Africa and Brazil, and technological prowess with China and India and Russia. In PPP terms, BRICS has already surpassed G7 in global GDP share. The expansion cements control over the critical supply chains in energy, food, and manufacturing. The convergence of BRICS Plus and RIC forms an institutional and strategic umbrella that can really shield its member states from Western sanctions. That's why the entire financial systems are being re-engineered right now. The rewiring of the global trade away from the Western dependencies and frame alternative discourses on security, sovereignty, and development away from the Western narratives. As the West accelerates its own self-destructive confrontation with Russia, it ironically cements the East's solidarity and global peace. The world's next order won't be just multipolar. It will be ideologically divergent, economically de-Americanized, and strategically insulated from NATO's reach. India's position in both RIC and BRICS Plus is pivotal because it allows it to become a balancer, shaping the emerging world order while retaining the strategic autonomy away from both West and China. The arrogance of sanctions is actually a colonial hangover that will define the geopolitics of the future. But the stakes now are nuclear. That is why the impact will be so profound. See, as we said, Russia is not Iraq, and India is not a British colony, and Europe is not invincible. By trying to subjugate Russia through economic warfare, Europe is risking its own annihilation. Unless Europe reclaims strategic autonomy from the US deep state, its capitals may well become the first victims of the 21st century nuclear conflagration. Remember, sovereignty cannot be sanctioned, and empires cannot be destroyed without consequences. The time for impact of sanity check may be running out for Europe, and indeed the entire world. If the Europeans and the Americans keep speeding their car up the edge of the cliff, the only way for the world may be the suicidal abyss below that. If you found this analysis valuable and it helped you understand the geopolitical situation within India and around the world better, please share it with your peers, families, and networks. On Drishtikon.com, we have written extensively on the criticality of the Arctic Circle and its ramifications. We have been pointing it out since July 2022, and I'll share those links in the description box below. Please subscribe, like, and share, and please do click on the bell icon. Most importantly, tell us in the comments, are the Europeans shoving the world towards a new world war? What will be its impact of the entire conflict that's going on between EU and Russia? And above all, what should India do? So please comment below, and until next time, Jai Hind.